So now we're going to take a quick look at scales. Obviously the type of music you're playing and the tuning make a big impact. We're going to stick with drop C again, C, G, C, F, A, D. And as a way of demoing that, we're going to look at the minor scale, specifically the natural minor scale. Without getting into classical music theory, which again, there's nothing wrong with music theory, I recommend starting with a visual representation of what notes are on your instrument, when it's guitar and when it's metal in particular, before moving on to sheet music as a way of transposing to other instruments. After all, sheet music is sort of based on the C major scale, and it's sort of based on a piano. That's an extreme oversimplification, of course, but I just mean that's kind of like a code to work with other things as well. If you're using guitar tabs, that's the quickest way of understanding what to play in written form. So I do recommend that instead of just knowing visually what frets are and everything. But for the time being, we're just going to look visually at where things are located and use that to form a scale. So I would start off by looking at just one string at a time to start with, and the scale as the set of notes on that string that you're allowed to play. And that would be the starting point for the scale. Before then you can figure out what you can do on the other strings as well. So for the minor scale, specifically natural minor, the actual numbers, if you were to write them down, memorize them, would be 0, 2, 3, 5, 7, 8, 10, meaning those are the frets that you're allowed to play on one string. So with either C string, that just means that those are the notes you're allowed to play, so to speak, if you're going to stay in that scale. It is not a bad idea to practice doing the scale all the way up and all the way down and all the variations, nothing wrong with that. But I do want to emphasize, it really just means those are the notes you can choose from, and there's not necessarily an inherent advantage in doing a scale exercise aside from the technique involved in forcing yourself to play something, which really doesn't have to be the scale. It could be any other exercise you choose. So you could go ahead and select your favorite song instead if you'd like. And same thing on the other C string. And in both cases it repeats again at 12 because that's the octave. It's C again. So again you have 12, 10, 8, 7, 5, 3, 2, 0. So right away you can see one advantage of a drop tuning, at least as far as starting out and seeing visually where notes go, is that you don't have to think as much about doing an interval between notes just in order to play a scale on multiple strings. So the best example of that is a power chord of just playing all 3 strings at once by just holding your finger down on those strings. Just doing that plays a scale using power chords. So to translate that to other strings, the G string is actually very similar, except that the frets differ in one place. It's really just a math problem to get there anytime you approach with a new scale and have to figure it out for yourself, since the G string is the same as the 7th fret on the C below it. Then just think in terms of those numbers. So since you had 7, 8, 10, 12, well, if you're using the G string instead of 7, then instead of 8, 10, 12, since you're starting at 0, then instead of 8, 10, 12, you have 0, 1, 3, 5. If this is 0, then it's 1, 3, 5. And so that's exactly what you do on the string. So now if you'd like, instead of actually playing the 7th fret, when you go up the scale, you can just go right to the next string. So it's 0, 2, 3, 5, and then 0, 1, 3, 5. Continuing up, because you have C again, then you already have 0, so you can continue all the way up if you'd like, or of course you can think right away what you're doing on the F string, which is equivalent to 5. So starting at 5, instead of 7, 8, 10, 12, if you start at 5, then it is really 2, 3, 5, 7. It's 2, 3, 5, 7, equivalent to this. So the full sequence then, after you get up to this middle C string, that said, I never really practiced scales in their entirety when learning. I really just remembered what the notes were that were in the scale, so that wherever I was on the fretboard I could choose those and make sure I'm still in a key, you know, making it easier to come up with things and just have things sound melodic, or break the scale and have it sound dissonant if I wanted to. So because of that, it's useful to know what notes are in that key on each string. So for the time being, especially because once I get into riffing, I start with the bottom 4 strings, then use the higher ones more just for soloing or things a little trickier. Then you can think of the G string as a very similar pattern of the numbers, you know, 0, 2, 3, 5, 7, 8, 10, 12, except with one difference, and that one difference is instead of 2, you have 1. So with the C string, it's 0, 2, 3. G is just 0, 1, 3, and then it's the same. So this means any of those notes on either of those 2 strings falls in that scale. And then the F string, again, only one variation from the C string, so it otherwise would have the same pattern. So instead of 0, 2, 3, 5, 7, 8, 10, 12, instead of 8, you have 9 on the F string. And at any point, if you want to, you know, check yourself, make sure that you're doing it correctly, just think of what this 9 is. This 9 is the same as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Go 5 up, but 1 string down. It's the same as this note here. And because everything resets at 12, because that's the octave, like 0, then this is essentially the same as 2. And so that's how you know it falls in that same scale. So again, looking at everything as the series of those numbers. And then you're just replacing up here. So that gives you a pretty good arsenal to work with for the C minor scale, specifically natural minor. So from the top down, get a little better look. So as you can see, one disadvantage of the drop tuning is because you have a big interval of 7, then you have to remember something different for the transition here. But honestly, in my opinion, that's more of a problem with remembering how to play the scale from, from bottom to top, just note to note, and yet it ends up helpful for some of the intervals between strings, because it is pretty common that you want to play the fifth chord, which just means two strings where the gap is 7 between them. So what I mean by that, this open note C and open note G, because they are 7 frets apart, that's basically called the fifth, or the perfect fifth. So you can do that on the other strings, of course. So here, 3rd fret on the G string and 5th fret on the C string. That's the same chord that you have with just playing the same fret on the first C and then G string, just in a different place, of course. Just a brief intro to what the other scales are without trying to really learn them or practice them. The harmonic minor scale is what some people would think of as the minor scale. It's actually a bit darker or sadder, at least in people's opinions sometimes. So thinking of that same number pattern, 0, 2, 3, 5, 7, 8, 10, 12, instead of having 10, you have 11. So that leaves a big gap between the 8 and the 11. And that becomes the distinct feature of that scale. So it gives it a lot of its flavor. So you can even just play the scale, or not the whole scale necessarily, but just emphasize that gap, and it really gives a minor feel to the song right away. Playing the whole scale. The major scale is a bit different. The numbers are 0, 2, 4, 5, 7, 9, 11, 12. I know it might sound silly now to just hear the numbers and think that means you're going to learn this scale. So I really just say that to implant the idea in your mind that it could be done that way, looking at the frets as your reference point rather than at sheet music, because I really do use those frets as a starting point for a scale anytime I think of a piece that I know has to follow that key, is I just think numerically. When you look at sheet music, it has flats and sharps based off of the, essentially how a piano is tuned for C major. So this is, the easy case where that would work, because I just played a C major scale. That would be all the white keys on a piano. But for any other scale, literally any, the presence of flats and sharps doesn't really make as much sense on a fretted instrument. The gap between 4 and 5 is different from the gap between 5 and 7. So to me that makes more sense, as opposed to in sheet music where, yeah, you can figure it out, but you see E, F, G, and again, not that complicated if you're familiar with music notation, but it is not really as intuitive for starting out. If you are a guitarist that is just picking up guitar because you want to play, then thinking of it as E, F, G will get you places, because then you know what you are playing, but it's kind of a workaround to learn how music scales work first, and then hopefully if you haven't given up by then you get to actually playing it. So that's why I start this way. That said, you really shouldn't be tied to a scale strictly, especially if you're getting into more dissonant, more aggressive forms of metal, or if you're actually trying to be more technical and not limit yourself to regular scales. A good example of an alternate scale is Hungarian minor. So with that, the note pattern is 0, 2, 3, 6, 7, 8, 11. that has a really ambiguous center, meaning it's hard to tell that C was really the root there if you're playing a piece that uses all of those notes wherever on the fretboard. And that's kind of what helps give it its feel. It's a lot more exotic. It's kind of a more Eastern European. So I bring that up not because I think you need to memorize particular scales, but just because that's a good way of immediately changing the overall feel of a piece. By choosing harmonic minor, you can force it to sound that way. Choosing a Hungarian minor, you force it to sound that way. And then you're a bit more free to mess with the actual riff, the actual melody, once you've settled on an overall theme. Of course, one advantage of knowing the center or the base of the scale is based on the tuning. It can actually make it easy to do things like thinking of that series of numbers and just playing one string over and over again, but then doing something different with your left hand. So without really writing anything, as long as you just stick to those numbers of frets, then you automatically have something that works. And so that's why, to start off, I would recommend playing a lot of things in C minor and C major, or G minor, G major, just because then you can use any of those four strings kind of as a basis for writing things, or even if not writing, just sort of playing and practicing, following the concept of what notes you know you can play that fit with each other, as opposed to just playing the chromatic scale, which just means every single note. The chromatic scale really just means 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It just means you're playing all the notes that are on a guitar, everything that has a fret.